Hey everybody, welcome back to Gideon Stuff and welcome to another episode of Gideon Stuff Adventures. Today, we've got a really special one for you. And of course, you already know what it is. You've seen the title, you've seen the thumbnail. Today, we're leaving my beloved New Mexico and we're going to Utah to visit one of my favorite national parks, Arches. The American West is known for some of the most spectacular scenery anywhere on the planet. And Utah, especially southern Utah, has some of the most spectacular national parks in the entire country. These include Arches, of course, Canyonlands, Capitol Reef, Zion, and I love all of them so much. I'm a huge fan of desert climates and big rock formations, and southern Utah has all of that in spades. Arches is very special to me, and it is my favorite national park from Utah. It's close. Zion is really awesome. Canyonlands is awesome. Capitol Reef is my least favorite of the Utah parks, but Arches for me is really special because it was one of the first national parks that I remember going to as a kid, and I really enjoyed being there. And of course, seeing all of these natural stone bridges is kind of magical, to be completely honest. I have been fortunate enough that this year I've actually gone to Arches twice within a month. I went once in May and then I went again in June, almost exactly a month later. Had a lot of fun, had a blast both times, went for two very different reasons, and I think it's time that I made a video about Arches. We're going to talk about the formation of the arches themselves, we're going to talk about the regional geology of the area, and we're really going to talk a lot about the Jurassic Southwest. But before we get into all of that kind of stuff, let's jump out of an airplane.
So quiet and so calm.
Oh yeah?
Like you don't hear a thing.
Okay. Not even playing?
I didn't do this for peace.
No, you're
I'm
recording
here
it?
for the
Yeah.
adrenaline.
I am.
No one's like,
you might be disappointed.
I need the adrenaline shot.
You might be disappointed. If you want adrenaline, you should probably jump last because the most adrenaline you'll feel is probably watching it. And then the last like 50 to 100 feet.
All right, Brandon's going last for the first time in his life.
Dude, you finally realize you are high up and you are moving fast.
Oh yeah?
Like you are moving fast.
120 miles per hour.
Start with Caitlin. We're about to jump out of an airplane. How do you feel about this, Caitlin?
I have fast-acting anxiety pills I would probably be taking.
She's not even jumping. I think she's more nervous than any of us. Chase has not before. How do you feel, Chase?
Hold my rein.
Brandon?
We're hyped. You know?
I'm ready to go.
Ryan's ready to go. Let's do this. I'm not nervous yet. Josh?
Yeah, not yet.
Not yet?
Well, you still got
That'll-
another.
Yeah, I'm just waiting.
Yeah, that'll probably change.
Once I'm like,
We probably have another hour and a half until we start going in the plane.
Yeah.
I think once we're in the plane going up is when I'll start to get
Once they open up the door halfway there to
See-
pressurize the cabin,
When they open the
That
door,
gets loud.
that's when I'm going to be like,
that gets loud.
this is happening. This is
Pressurize
real.
the cabin.
Yo, Mario, what's going on? I'm super excited. It's gonna be awesome. Haha, go skydiving. First time. First time. We got all the boys here. I'm ready. That's the plane. Let's go do it. Let's do it. First skydive, how's that? First skydive, oh man, so glad I did it. That was fantastic. Yeah, dude, welcome to skydiving. Thanks for jumping at Skydive Moab.
So yeah, back in May, I was in Moab to do some skydiving. One of my buddies got married and we did a big, one last hurrah with the boys. And so I went skydiving. I highly recommend it. I think everyone should go skydiving at least once. I'm definitely going to do it again. I think I'm going to get my skydiving license. That sounds like a great idea because I had so much fun. It was so peaceful and exhilarating at the same time. It's hard to explain. As we were free falling at 130 miles an hour out of the airplane, I couldn't stop laughing. But that's kind of a hard thing to do when you're falling at 130 miles an hour. So I'm falling, I'm going, and just like, getting all the air sucked out of me, all the moisture drained from my mouth. But it was incredible. 10 out of 10 would definitely do again. I love the Moab area. I really do. There is so much to see and do. It's incredible. It's kind of heaven on earth for outdoor enthusiasts like myself. If you like hiking and camping, off-roading, if you enjoy nature, geology, if you like thrill-seeking, skydiving and stuff like that, Moab is the place to be. I love Utah in general in a lot of ways. Utah's one of my favorite states. Maybe my second favorite. Maybe. There's some things I really don't like about Utah, but as far as like the scenery goes, Utah is stunningly beautiful. And the geology is pretty interesting as well. I already mentioned there's a lot to see in Moab. When you're in Moab, you have access to Arches National Park. Canyonlands is not that far. Dead Horse Point State Park is a really cool place to go and camp, do some hiking. You can actually get into Canyonlands from there. I've done that a couple of times. There's Utah Raptor State Park pretty close by. Moab Giants, which is an outdoor museum with life-size replicas of dinosaurs. They have a 3D aquarium. There's so much cool stuff in Moab that just tickles me on so many levels. My nerdy side, my adrenaline junkie side, I freaking love Moab. Anyways, after skydiving and eating at the Moab Diner, my roommates and I decided to go to Arches and do a little bit of exploring. I did not record as much footage as I normally do. I always feel weird about recording when there's like other people around. Not because I look like a weirdo. I don't really care about looking like a weirdo. But because even though we're in a public area, I don't like putting people in my videos without their permission. So like having crowds of people on camera, it's not like an issue, but for me it kind of is. And so I just, I didn't record as much as I normally do for my adventure videos. And there's a lot of places that we didn't get to see. Arches is pretty big. I would say that if you're going to visit really any national park, you need to plan at least 2 days, at least, to see not everything, but, a good sampling, a good chunk. So if you're, just there for a day or an afternoon, you're definitely going to have to be very picky and choosy about what you see. Now, if you go to Arches, even if you only have an afternoon, I think it's pretty much a must to go to Delicate Arch. We'll talk about Delicate Arch here in a little bit. But yeah, Arches isn't the biggest national park by any means, but there's a ton to see. All right, so I'm going to show some footage from the park here in just a second. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the formation of the park, why Arches is here, and what makes it special. Arches National Park has the highest concentration of natural stone arches in the world. There are over 2,000 arches in the park. Some of them are small, some of them are huge. A lot of them are pretty iconic. I mean, Delicate Arch is one of the most photographed natural features on the planet. It's used in a lot of iconography throughout Utah. Arches is pretty important and pretty iconic. A natural arch is formed via erosion by wind, water, or gravity. Now, I've been asked several times, if there's a difference between a rock arch, a natural bridge, and a rock window. And I've answered this before in other videos, but we're going to answer it again today because it seems especially pertinent. But the answer is, geologically speaking, no. They all form through the same processes, and there's really no difference. The difference in the nomenclature really just comes down to location. So if a rock arch spans a waterway, like an arroyo or a creek, a river, typically that's called a rock bridge. If the arch is high up on a thin fin of rock and it's kind of just a hole through a wall, we call that a rock window. But they're all formed from the same processes and they're all arches, right? So I find that the different terminology between a window and a natural bridge and a rock arch to be pedantic and not all that interesting, but I get asked about that a lot, so I figured I'd answer it. Rock arches can form anywhere in any kind of rock. In fact, I've made several videos on this channel about arches formed in igneous rocks, primarily rhyolites. But why are there so many arches in this one little area of Utah? What makes Arches National Park special? Tectonics. The tectonic formation of Arches National Park started about 75 million years ago. I bet some of you perked up. If you've been watching this series on my channel for a while, that 75 million years ago time frame should sound familiar. That's right, it's the Laramide orogeny, baby. Woo! Gotta love the Laramide. This was a mountain building event that occurred from the late Cretaceous to the Oligocene between about 75 million years ago and 45 million years ago. It's the orogeny that gave us the Rocky Mountains, and it led to a lot of thick-skinned crustal deformation in the American West. This was caused by a tectonic plate, the Farallon plate, and also the Kaloa plate, that's more north. The Farallon plate subducted entirely underneath North America, but instead of immediately falling into the mantle, it slid for several thousand kilometers underneath the continent, pushing up the crust and forming a lot of mountains in the process. All right, so that's awesome. We've talked about the Laramide a lot on this channel. Really, really cool tectonic event. But when we're talking about the history of arches, we also have to talk about salt tectonics. When geologists talk about salt, they're referring broadly to evaporite minerals. These can include like actual rock salt, halite, but also things like gypsum. Evaporite minerals are minerals that were formed via precipitation. So basically you had water that had these minerals dissolved in it. Think about salt water that has a lot of dissolved salt in it. And then when that water evaporates, it leaves the salt behind. The water turns to a gas, in this case it's the atmosphere, and the salt is left behind where it crystallizes. Evaporite sequences in the rock record can be pretty extensive. Some of them are associated with like entire oceans evaporating. So there are tons and tons of huge, thick gypsum and salt layers underground, and they behave very differently than most other rock units. Salt tectonics is so interesting because salts are ductile at low temperatures. This means that they can be squished and mushed and stretched and bent and piled up without having to be heated that much. All rocks can behave ductily. If you bury a rock deep enough, the deeper you go into the crust, the closer you get to the mantle, the hotter things become. And eventually, you can make a rock hot enough that it behaves kind of like taffy. If you've ever seen a video of someone pulling taffy in a candy shop, that's kind of how rocks behave when they get heated up to a sufficient degree. They're not a liquid, but they're kind of a pliable solid. Salt formations, however, do not need to reach these high temperatures. They can be ductile pretty much basically at the surface almost. Pretty much basically almost. Fuck. The pliability of salt units means that when you do have tectonic disturbances in an area, the salt is going to react in an exaggerated manner. It's going to pile up. It's going to stretch. It's going to get squished and compressed. It's going to act as a lubricant between more typical rock layers and make them do weird things. Enter the Paradox Basin. I love the Paradox Basin. I'm going to try not to ramble too much, but I freaking love the Paradox Basin. I've done some work out there. In fact, I have a rather large stratigraphic and biased stratigraphic column that I put together through some research at the Paradox Basin. I have no idea where it is right now. If I have pictures of it, I'll throw it on the screen. I think I have pictures of the rough draft. Anyways, we're not going to ramble about it too much. It deserves its own video, but it's a really, really interesting piece of the Southwest geology. It covers an area mostly in Utah and Colorado. This is going to be southeastern Utah, southwestern Colorado, but also northwestern New Mexico and northeastern Arizona. And basically what the Paradox Basin is a huge accumulation of evaporite rock units. These evaporites piled up during the Paleozoic, and they were buried in the subsurface for much of the Mesozoic and early Cenozoic, including in the subsurface around the area surrounding Arches. So basically, when the Laramide orogeny kicked off, and it started kind of crinkling the Earth's crust from west to east, it hit the Paradox Basin, this huge evaporite reservoir. And what happened? Well, all those salts got squished and piled up into a bunch of salt domes and salt anticlines. An anticline is kind of a hump-shaped geologic fold. The rocks sitting on top of these evaporite layers were primarily Mesozoic sedimentary rocks, including the Jurassic Age San Rafael Group. Now, these rocks were not buried at a depth to make them ductile at the moment. But remember, salt doesn't really need that high heat. So what happened was when these salt anticlines were building and forming, they were pushing on the bottom of the sandstones laying on top of them, pushing up. And what this did was it caused the sandstones to crack. Because the sandstones weren't ductile yet, they were allowed to just kind of split instead of bending with the salt. And these cracks and fissures would eventually lead to the formation of all the canyons and arches that southeastern Utah is so well known for. The actual formation of the arches that we see today in the national park is a relatively recent occurrence. See, all of that land had to be uplifted with the rest of the Colorado Plateau, and the layers on top of the rockiness that would eventually produce the arches had to be eroded away. We call this exhumation and unroofing. Exhuming rock layers means taking things that were previously in the subsurface and pushing them up to expose them at the surface, and to expose them, you have to erode the stuff on top of them away, which is the unroofing. Most of the arches in Arches are formed in the Entrada sandstone, which is primarily what we're going to be talking about today. This is where our next big ingredient for the formation of arches comes into play, and that is porosity and permeability. Have you ever wondered how rock layers store things like aquifers or natural gas, oil? It all comes down to permeability and porosity. A lot of people like to picture an aquifer or an oil reservoir as like a big underground lake or puddle that we stick a straw in and suck the tasty fluid out of, but that's completely wrong. What actually happens is the water, the hydrocarbons, whatever it is stored in the rock itself, and all has to do with porosity and permeability. The porosity of a rock is the space between grains, either clastic grains or mineral grains. So you can think about it as kind of like a sponge. A sponge is a solid object, right? But it can store a lot of water into it because it has space between all of its fibers. The permeability of a rock unit is the ability for water, natural gas, whatever, to get into the rock. The Entrada sandstone is a very porous sandstone. Sandstones are made up of sand. Surprise, I guess. And sand is primarily quartz bits. Little tiny bits of quartz and sometimes feldspar that have eroded off of pre-existing rocks. In the Entrada sandstone, these little tiny sand grains are held together by calcite. Now, the process of sand becoming sandstone involves cementation and lithification. The cementation process means that you have a chemical binder that gathers up all the loose bits and holds them together. And in this case, that binder was calcite, which is a carbonate mineral. Now, in the case of the Entrada sandstone, it wasn't really compacted all that completely, and so there's a lot of space between all the different sand grains. What this means is that it has high porosity, not highly porositic. Porositic. That's not a word. I guarantee that's not a word. Anyways, it has a high degree of porosity. It's also very permeable. So that means that water can get in to the Entrada sandstone. Now, in the case of aquifers and hydrocarbon reserves, porosity is great because it controls how much of that substance can be stored in a rock unit. So if you have low porosity, you can only hold so much water. If you have high porosity, you can hold a lot of water. But that doesn't matter unless you have a non-permeable rock unit sitting underneath your permeable rock unit. Why? Well, because if it's all permeable, the water will just run through. It won't get trapped. However, if you have a permeable rock unit sitting on top of a non-permeable rock unit, the water gets in there and it gets trapped. It can't leak out the bottom. And if you have a high porosity rock, that means you can slowly gather a bunch of water or oil or whatever into this rock and it can't escape. The Entrada sandstone sits on top of another sandstone called the Carmel sandstone, or the Carmel formation. The Carmel formation is significantly less permeable than the Entrada sandstone. So what this means is that water leaking into the Entrada has a hard time escaping through the Carmel, which means that that water sits inside the Entrada formation. Now you guys might also remember from some of my previous videos that calcite is highly susceptible to carbonation erosion. I'll give you the Cliff Notes version here. Basically, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere mixes with water in the atmosphere to form carbonic acid. This water falls as acid rain, and when it hits calcite, it eats it and dissolves it. So what you have in the Entrada formation is acid rain that falls into the rock, and it interacts with the calcite and dissolves those bonds holding the sand grains together. Basically, the rock is dissolving from the inside out. So you loosen up all the rock, the sand particles get a little bit loose, you got some wind blowing on there, you got some gravity working, eventually bits of the rock are going to fall away, bada bing, bada boom, you have arches. How did the water get in there though? Remember I talked about the salt domes causing a bunch of cracks and fissures all over all throughout these sandstones? There you go. That's how the water is getting in there. That's how it's eroding out these big canyons, these gorges, these big depressions, and of course, the arches.
I know. Wouldn't that be amazing? I was actually going to do that when we hit the ground, just kiss the earth. No, that would have been iconic. You kidding me? It's the one that has the most antibodies and stuff in it.
I'd like it. I'd like wrestling that's produced within the first 48 hours of birth.
Yep. I think it's the first couple of days. And it's like yellow and sticky. It's like really rich in sugars. Yeah, you know what? Yeah. It's manna.
No, I have not tried it. Actually, I have when I was a little baby. You have too, I bet. Did your mom breastfeed you?
Yeah.
And you have too. What, you've never drank milk? You mean like human milk?
Yeah.
I don't know. PETA would love you. Have you ever seen those images from PETA where it's like the dairies, but they have like humans? No, they've got like humans hooked up to the machines. Well, you know, think about that for a second though. Like, how many different milks have you had in your life?
What a bet. You know, you said that one time. Yeah, that's
This is really, really cool. This little outcrop of rock, I think, is still Entrada sandstone. Could be Navajo. It's a little more pale in color, which the Navajo typically is. But these features right here are really, really beautiful sedimentary features. What we see here is a bunch of cross beds. And all these foresets, you can see some are going like that, some are going like that. This is wind-blown sand. These patterns are the sides of dunes. And so these are sand dunes that have been petrified. These are from the Jurassic period. You know, we're talking 180 million years ago. That is gorgeous. It does, doesn't it? All right, so now we're headed to Delicate Arch because we want to see the sunset there. We took a like 4-mile detour out of the blue at our last stop, so I threw out my leg. I think we're all just exhausted. This is gonna be fun. At least it's not a long walk, and it's gonna be gorgeous, so that'll be good. No, I'm the worst.
It's kind of sketchy with the way to be honest.
So. This is what it's all about, man. Delicate Arch is one of the most photographed natural features on the planet. As we discussed earlier, it's been used in a ton of iconography throughout Utah and even throughout the Southwest in general. Sometimes you'll be driving through a small town in Arizona or Colorado or New Mexico or Nevada, and you'll see like a restaurant that's like Desert Grill, and they'll have Delicate Arch as part of their logo. It's super iconic, and for good reason. It's really interesting. It's a freestanding 52-foot tall arch, kind of in the middle of nowhere. It sits on top of this, little flat area. There's this big kind of depression in the bottom, a big pan is what we call those. It is iconic, and it's definitely something worth seeing. I think it should be on the top of your list if you're going to arches. Like, you've got to see Delicate Arch. I think everyone should see Delicate Arch in person at least once in their lifetime. And the trail to get to it is not that strenuous at all. It can be a little bit unpleasant at times, I guess, if you're not used to hiking through the desert. If it's, hot and stuff, it could be a little bit rough, especially if you're going up the big rock slab. during the first third of the trail, but it's definitely worth seeing for sure. Now, one thing that I find hilarious about Delicate Arch is that Delicate Arch was not always called Delicate Arch. In fact, early cowboys in the area had a bunch of different names for Delicate Arch, and some of them are absolute freaking gold. These names include the Shaps, which makes sense, right? Cowboys, and yeah, Delicate Arch does look like some bow-legged cowboy standing out there in the desert with his top half cut off. You know, it's like cow wrangling Darth Maul. Some of the other names include Schoolmarm's Bloomers. There's a lot of names that involve bloomers. Bloomer's Arch, simply. Mary's Bloomers. Who's Mary? I don't know. But she's running around Utah without her bloomers, I guess. Old Maid's Bloomers. Saltwash Arch, which is, you know, okay, whatever. Schoolmarm's Pants. Kind of along the same line as the bloomers. But my favorite former name for Delicate Arch is actually Pants Crotch. Yes, Delicate Arch has been called Pants Crotch in the past. In fact, it wasn't until the 1930s that Delicate Arch was first called Delicate Arch. Honestly, I think we should go back to Pants Crotch. Personally, I think that's iconic right there. Of course, Arches is full of a lot of iconic scenery. Landscape Arch is definitely worth seeing as well. It is I think it's the longest, I think it's the widest arch in the world. It might just be the widest arch in the United States. I know it's the widest arch in the United States, but it might be the widest one in the world. I have to double check that. But it's definitely worth seeing, especially since a big chunk of it fell off a couple years ago, so we don't even know how much longer it's going to be around. This is a dynamic landscape. It's ever-changing. It's not going to be around forever, unfortunately. Go and see it. If you like the inappropriately named rock formations, there is a rock formation out there called the Phallus. Because, yeah, it looks like a giant wing just sticking up out of the desert. I'm glad they kept that one's name. One of my favorite arches in the park is actually Double Arch. And one of the reasons is because the opening sequence of one of my favorite movies was filmed out there. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. In the very opening shot, when Indiana Jones and his Boy Scout troop are out exploring in Arches, you've got a lot of panning shots of Arches, and it's all real beautiful. But there's a big cave near Double Arch. And if you go up into this cave, it's cool. It's kind of like a little cave. But in the movie, they added a little side passage that Indy and his friend crawl through, where they find I'm not sure if the guy was an archaeologist or just a treasure hunter, but anyways, the treasure hunters are uncovering that golden cross. I think they said it belonged to Coronado, I think. And of course, shenanigans ensue. Indy chases this guy down. There's a huge action set piece on a train. And actually, that train is a Cumbres and Toltec scenic railway, narrow gauge railway. It was filmed. Where the frick was that sentence going? The train used in that sequence was from the Cumbres and Toltec narrow gauge railway that runs between Antonito, Colorado and Chama, New Mexico. That's where I grew up, in that area. Antonito is where we'd go shopping a lot when I was a kid. It's a really tiny southern Colorado town, and the house that Indiana Jones lived in is actually there in Antonito. You can still go there. I've been there. It's awesome. A lot of the landscape shots while they're on the train, you can actually see a lot of places where I ran around as a kid. So I love that movie because of that connection, I guess, but also it's just a freaking great movie. And yeah, it starts at Arches. And I kind of wanted to make a video where it's like kind of recreating that opening scene where I'd go to that cave out there in Arches and then go to the Cumbres and Toltec, go to the Indiana Jones house. I might still do that. That would be fun. Because Last Crusade is a banger of a movie. And I would love to do an homage to it.
Spike. But will we ever have that feeling again?
All right, so let's go ahead and talk a little more specifically about some of the lithologies in the park itself. The rocks exposed in Arches range from Paleozoic passive margin sediments to Cenozoic volcanics, but really we only want to focus in on the Jurassic Age rocks. And even then, we really only want to focus in on one group. And we're going to talk mostly about one formation in that group. And that group is the San Rafael Group. You might have heard me mention this already. The San Rafael Group is named after the San Rafael Swell in south central Utah. And it includes a bunch of different rock formations from the early to middle Jurassic. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about terminology. When we talk about a geologic group, this is a collection of rock formations that formed in consecutive order in kind of similar environments. So there could be distinct ages between these different units, but if they're all related to the same area and the same general span of time, you can group them all, you can put them all in a group. Now, each of these formations is distinguished by being easily identifiable and mappable. So, for example, the Entrada sandstone, that's going to be the unit that we most talk about today. That's a formation. The Entrada sandstone is very easily recognizable. It has excellent exposures throughout the southwest, the Four Corner states, especially, also Wyoming. It's got distinguishing features that make it easily recognizable. It's large enough that it can be mapped, so it is a formation. Now, within a formation, you can also have members. Members are different facies of formation where maybe the lithology changes slightly. It's still related to the formation. For example, you could have a formation that's predominantly sandstone, but it has thin lenses of shales or mudstones throughout it. And so you can split that into different members. The Entrada sandstone is split into a bunch of different members, including the Moab member, which, shock horror, is exposed near Moab, Utah. We're not going to go too far into different members and stuff in this video, but I did want you guys to just kind of understand the nested hierarchy of group, formation, members. I gotta interject too. Some of my favorite exposures of the Entrada sandstone are actually in New Mexico. I know it's more commonly known from Utah, but in New Mexico we actually have exposures up in this area here, around Abiquiu, around Mesa Viejos. Some really, really beautiful classic red rock cliffs. Also down near San Isidro, in this area right in here, there's some great exposures as well. I have plans to make a video about this area. In New Mexico, the Entrada sandstone sits underneath a unit called the Todito Formation, which I have a lot of experience with. I love that formation. So I'll save time about that for that video. But in Utah, where we see the Entrada sandstone, it's actually overlain by the Curtis Formation. So we're not gonna worry about that right now. The San Rafael Group is characterized by sedimentary rocks from the early to middle Jurassic that lie between the Navajo Sandstone and the Morrison Formation. The Navajo Sandstone is an arid, like desert deposited sandstone unit that is latest Triassic to early Jurassic in age. It's a little bit controversial. There's some, you can go both ways. It's probably both, but it's actually exposed out in Arches as well. It's more famously exposed in places like Capitol Reef. If you look at pictures of some Utah scenery where you have like these really big white sandstone formations, these cuestas and reefs, that's most likely the Navajo sandstone. It's very commonly a very stark white color. It's pretty cool. The Morrison Formation is the most dinosaur fossil dense, I should say, formation in the United States. This is where we get a lot of fossils of some of our most classic Jurassic Age dinosaurs. Our sauropods, Apatosaurus, Diplodocus, Camarasaurus. This is where we get Stegosaurus, Allosaurus, Ceratosaurus. Some of the most famous dinosaurs of all time. Now, because the San Rafael Group sits between our Navajo Sandstone and our Morrison Formation, that means that it's younger than the Navajo and older than the Morrison. Remember, principles of stratigraphy. What's interesting about the San Rafael Group, and the reason why you can include a bunch of these different formations as part of the same group, things like the Curtis Formation, the Totilto Formation, things like that, Carmel Formation, which we already mentioned. The reason why you can say that all these different formations are part of the same group is because they all have a little bit of marine influence. Some of these units have more of a marine influence than others, but these rocks were all deposited in or around the Sundance Sea. The Sundance Sea was a shallow empiric sea that existed during the Middle Jurassic. You can basically think of if you took the Arctic Ocean and stretched it down through Canada and into northern New Mexico. That was kind of the extent of this ocean. And it was shallow, and during this time, Earth was a lot warmer, and this ocean would have been surrounded by swamps in some areas, but predominantly sand dunes. Huge, vast dune seas. Of course, this seaway would have been home to some pretty incredible creatures. Of course, your fish, shark teeth have been found in rocks deposited in this seaway, ammonites, other cephalopods, but also some marine reptiles, pliosaurs, plesiosaurs, ichthyosaurs. Some of my favorites are Ophthalmosaurus, an ichthyosaur that I think it has the largest eyes that we know of on a vertebrate animal. That might not be true anymore, but I'm pretty sure, I think that might be true. I'll double check myself on that. And also Megalnosaurus, which was the largest marine reptile in this area. That was a pliosaur, similar to the much more famous Liopleurodon, which was not as monstrous as it was portrayed in Walking with Dinosaurs, by the way. That thing was just absolutely bonkers. But a lot of really, really cool animals lived in the ocean. And on the beaches and the shores, dinosaurs roamed. In fact, there's a really famous fossil trackway in Wyoming, the Red Gulch dinosaur trackways, that show dinosaur footprints left behind by dinosaurs walking along the beaches of the Sundance Sea. Now, the formation that we want to focus on here is actually the Entrada sandstone, which was not deposited in a marine environment. It was deposited in a marginal marine or completely terrestrial environment. The Entrada sandstone is made up primarily of sandstones, as you might expect, and most of these are aeolian sandstone, which means wind-blown sediments. These will be sand dunes. We'll get back to that here in a second. But there's also thinner layers within the Entrada sandstone that are mudstones and siltstones, and these were deposited in tidal flats. So what the Entrada sandstone represents is actually a little bit of shrinking of the Sundance Sea. The sea, of course, retreated by the time the Morrison Formation was being deposited, or at least it had retreated more towards the north. We'd had some uplift happening throughout this part of North America, and that was pushing the sea back. There is, again, the Morrison Formation has some swampy flavors to it, but it's also rather dry and arid in other places. But the Entrada sandstone represents kind of the Sundance Sea on a retreat. As it's shrinking, we're growing these dune fields, or one of my favorite words ever, an erg. Erg. What is an erg? Well, it's a type of landscape that is characterized by a huge expanse of wind-blown sand dunes. I'm not sure what the actual designation of like how big something has to be considered an erg. I'll write it right here. But if you're not that big, you're just a dune field. However, ergs cover thousands of kilometers and they really don't have much vegetation. There's not a whole lot of water. Very, very dry, rough place. Several ergs exist on the planet today, mainly in the Arabian Peninsula and Africa. But during the Jurassic, these large ergs were very, very common across North America and across the world. There was others too. Now, because of the nature of an erg, fossilization is not common. In fact, really the only vertebrate fossil that's ever been found in the Entrada sandstone is Entradasuchus, which was a Jurassic-aged crocodile. The Entrada sandstone is known for trace fossils, including insect burrows and trails, but the body fossil preservation of the sandstone is relatively poor. In fact, I'd say it's overall pretty freaking poor. But it beautifully preserves, absolutely beautifully preserves a lot of great sedimentary structures, including cross-bedding. And you'll see me talk about cross-bedding in this video while I'm out at the park several times. These beautiful kind of sweeping lines through the rock are the remains of sand dunes. All right, so I was talking about wind-blown sand in these ergs, and we mentioned the word aeolian. Aeolian is the word that geologists use to describe a wind-blown environment. So when we talk about aeolian sand dunes, these are sand dunes that are shaped, formed, piled up, created primarily via wind. So when we're looking at these cross-bedding, and when we're looking at the cross-bedding in the Entrada sandstone, it can tell us a lot about the environment. When we're looking at these sweeping lines, what we're seeing is how sediment was accumulating. We can see the wind side of the dune, where the wind was blowing sediment, moving it up and away, and the lee side, which is typically a little more rounded, where the sediment was accumulating or was being protected from the wind. And this tells us a lot of really useful information. Not only does it tell us that, well, yeah, okay, this was a dune field, this was an erg back in the Jurassic period, 160 million years ago, but it also tells us which direction the wind was blowing. It tells us which direction all sediments were piling up, and that allows us to make inferences about, well, where were the mountains back then? How was the landscape oriented? What kind of winds were we looking at? All kinds of really, really cool inferences can be made from these incredibly well-preserved sedimentary structures. And a quick note about sedimentary structures. When you're looking at rocks, especially sedimentary rocks, there's two kinds of structures that you can sort the things you see into. Sedimentary structures and deformational structures, also sometimes called primary and secondary. Sedimentary structures or primary structures were deposited when the rock was being formed or when the sediment was being laid down. So this can be ripples on the bottom of a riverbed. This can be sand dunes that are being blown by the wind. That is going to be primary sedimentation. Secondary or deformational structures are things that happen to the rock after it already lithified. So this can be cracks, this can be folds, this can be alteration, dissolution. Anything that changes the way the rock looks or messes with it after it's already lithified is going to be a secondary deformational structure. So next time you're at Arches, or if you've never been, when you go to Arches, because you absolutely should, take a close look at the rocks. Really, really study them and see if you can find this cross-bedding. And then you can wow and amaze all of your friends and you tell them, hey, this rock here is cross-bedded. That tells me that this at one point was sand dunes. And then you can shock them too and say, oh, look, this right here, that's the wind-blown side of the dune. And then this little curve over here, that's the lee side of the dune. That's where the sediment is piling up. They'll definitely think it's cool and not that you're a weird rock-obsessed nerd. I find this to be so cool, and I love sedimentology. I love sedimentary structures, and so seeing these finely preserved, cross-bedded strata at Arches is always a lot of fun for me. It gets me super excited. Honestly, I get more excited about the cross-bedding than I do about the arches themselves, which is a very nerdy thing to do, but it's true. I freaking love the cross beds. So you can think that the Entrada sandstone is really made up of fossilized sand dunes. And actually there is a place in Arches called Petrified Dunes where you can go and walk through like, you know, these little whitish humps and stuff. That's actually Navajo sandstone, which was also deposited in an erg, but, you know, couple million years before the Entrada sandstone. Again, the late Triassic, early Jurassic in North America and of course across the world too was very, very dry, very arid. There were a lot of cycles of ergs growing and retreating, you know, oceans swelling and retreating, and we can see that throughout the stratigraphic column. It's just so freaking cool. And I think that's where I'm going to leave you guys today before I ramble on forever, because I probably could, to be completely honest with you. But I think that's a good stopping point. I hope you guys learned something. I hope you enjoyed this one. Again, not as much like in the field footage, which I apologize for, but yeah, if you've been to Arches, let me know. What do you think about it? If you haven't been, tell me that I've convinced you to go, please. Like, honestly, you should go. And support our national parks and public lands, okay? I gotta say that right now because, I mean, not even just right now when they're under threat, always, right? Our public lands are so important. We need to preserve this beautiful country for our kids and grandkids to see. Like, go and support your national parks, state parks, public lands, especially on the federal level, but you get what I'm saying. Anyways, that's going to be it for me today, guys. Big shout out to my channel members right here at the Cowboy level. I appreciate everything they do for the channel. If you want to become a member and get access to exclusive perks, there is a button down below. Feel free to join up and support me directly. As for the rest of you hooligans, thank you so much for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, comment below, and subscribe. I've been Gideon, and I'll see you in the next one. Adios.